Go ahead and get started. So hello to everybody out there. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians at the Hudson Library. Just a couple little announcements and I'll introduce our guest speaker tonight. We have a few programs you may be interested in that are coming up live via Zoom. The first one is Monday, August 30th at 7 p.m. We have Anne Hagedorn, who's going to introduce The Sleeper Agent, the atomic spy in America who got away. So again, that's Monday, August 30th at 7 p.m. There's another book you may be interested in. That's on Thursday, September 2nd, 6 p.m. We have Cian Evans, Voyages, Magnificent Ocean Liners, and the Women Who Traveled and Worked Aboard Them. So again, that's on Thursday, September 2nd, 6 p.m. So go to hudsonlibrary.org to find out about those and wonderful other programs we have here at the library. So tonight, we have the Learned Owl that's going to be giving links. There should be some links on the right here that somebody will put there about copies of the book. And we're actually talking about that before, that it's very hard to find a copy of your book, Rebecca. It's been sold out on a lot of places. Barnes & Noble, you can find it, but your local bookstore. Kate ordered a number of copies. So there'll be a link there during our program for the Learned Owl, and you can purchase a copy of tonight's book. So after the program, we will have time, so post your questions. There'll be a little Q&A button. You can post some questions for the author, and I'll read them for our author. Or you could put them on the right-hand side. There'll be a wonderful little chat feature. So let's introduce the author. So tonight we have with us Rebecca Donner, and she's going to be discussing her latest nonfiction book, Frequent Trouble of Our Days, and it has just been put on the New York Times bestsellers list. So a little bit about her. She was born in Vancouver, Canada, and was educated at the University of California at Berkeley and Columbia University. 2018-2019, she was a fellow at Leon Levy Center for Biography and taught writing at Wesleyan University, Columbia University, and Barnard College. She's the author of Sunset Terrace and Burnout, which is a graphic novel about ecoterrorism. Donner's essays and reviews have appeared in publications such as New York Times, Bookforum, Guernica, and The Believer. And the author is coming from us, New York, Brooklyn. So we'll turn it over to you.
Eric, thank you so much. And thanks to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. It's just an incredible pleasure for me to be here tonight and to speak to all of you out there who are watching this virtually. My book was published a couple weeks ago, and as Derek said, it hit the bestseller list immediately, and it's been sold out on Amazon and Powell's and a couple other major booksellers. And it's all been and it's just been an incredible experience for me to hear from readers and to share this story with everybody. I first learned about Mildred Hitchcock, who is my great-great-aunt, when I was just 9 years old. And I've told this story a few times, but I'll just repeat it very quickly for those of you who haven't heard it. I was about 9. I visited my great-grandmother in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and she asked me to stand up against the kitchen wall and put a ruler on my head and took my height, as all the children were asked to do. And I looked at the other marks on the wall, and I saw one, a very faint line with an M next to it. And I said, "Who's that?" And she said, "Well, that's Mildred." And that's all she said. And I sensed that there was a story there. And I knew she was my great-great-aunt. Mildred was my great-great-aunt. My great-great-grandmother was her eldest sister. And so just to get the genealogy straight. And so at the age of 9, I just sort of filed that away. And then when I was 16, I was talking with my grandmother, and she told me about Mildred, and she gave me Mildred's letters, and she knew that I had great ambitions to be a writer, and she said, "Here are Mildred's letters. You must write her story one day." And so that was a tremendous gift, and I also took it very seriously as a kind of responsibility. And so I went on and I published 2 works of fiction, and I had always, but in the back of my head, I thought, I have to write Mildred's story. And in 2016, in the run up to the presidential election, I felt like it was time. I felt that it was time for people to hear about Mildred Harnock and also her co-conspirators. Mildred is identified by historians as the only American in the leadership of the German resistance. She was born in Milwaukee, and I can talk a little bit more about how she went from Milwaukee to Berlin. Essentially, she became a leader of this underground resistance group, and I feel that it's important for people to understand that people did oppose Hitler in Germany. Many did not. This is very true, and that's also very important to understand. It's also important to understand that there are stories of those who did that have gone untold. And it's not just Mildred Harnock's stories, but it's also the stories of others in her group who have not really, people have not heard about them. And in my book, I have, this is my book. And in the photo insert, I have the Gestapo mugshots featured of some of them, some of the people in the group who were arrested and of course, later executed as traitors for standing up to Hitler. So I think that, anyway, the book is a very capacious book. It covers a lot of topics. I don't just focus on Mildred. I think of it as a kind of, and that is the primary focus, obviously. I think of it as a biography, but I also think of it as a fusion of biography and espionage thriller and scholarly detective story. I researched 4 different archives and did extensive research in the United States, in Germany, in England, and also in Russia. And I uncovered intelligence documents and letters and testimonies and even notes that were passed in prison, in a women's prison in Berlin, among Mildred's co-conspirators. I recovered those notes in an archive in Berlin. And so I have endeavored to really tell a very complete story and to look at my great-great-aunt in an objective manner, and also to sort of see her from all of these different viewpoints and get a kind of prismatic understanding of who she was and what she did. Derek, are you there? I feel like maybe you dropped out. I don't see you. Oh, there you are. Hi.
I probably should have told
you. Should I have gone on more? I could keep talking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please.
But no, I mean, that's my intro. That's my nutshell intro, and I'm happy to talk more. But I'll just pass the baton back to you. So you've read the book and I presume, I really would love to tell people about it and maybe tell people about certain sections that maybe resonated for you.
Yeah, I guess just from my background, I have a history background, public history actually, and I'm really interested in just everything about it. I guess your book, but really just the Soviet part, because you don't really get that too much. There was the Soviets, I guess, spy network, if you will. And then, of course, there was the sort of German anti-fascist. So it was a bit of a clashing, and it was really 2 different ideologies. So as you kind of go into that, like, why did that happen? Why was Stalin trying to get, Hitler out of power?
Oh, yes. Well, it's very, yes. The espionage, the question of espionage figures prominently with this group. And it's important to understand that people in Mildred's resistance group, and this is, I say Mildred's resistance group, there was no real sort of, when we talk about she was in the leadership, her husband Arvid Harnock was also in the leadership. It was a decentralized kind of organization, and the group that she started in her apartment, basically, in 1932, a year before Hitler was appointed chancellor, over the course of 8 years, became grew and intersected with at least 3 other underground resistance groups in Berlin. And by 1940, it was the largest underground resistance group in Berlin. That was also in 1939. The year before was when she started to engage in espionage for the United States. But just to back up even further, I'm going to rewind and then fast forward. In 1935, her husband, Arvid Harnack, got a job at the Ministry of Economics, and he did this with the express purpose of getting himself into a high-level position as a Nazi, in the Nazi government, as an official who had access to top secret information about Hitler's operational strategies and later military strategies as it came to develop. In 1935, Hitler was assuring everybody in Germany and in the international community that peace was his objective. And in my book, I cite all of the speeches in which he said this. So he's telling everybody this while he is simultaneously violating the Treaty of Versailles, conditions and building up an army and preparing for war. And so Arvid Harnack, when he was at the Ministry of Economics, saw this, understood this, saw the documentation, and began stealing this information and then giving it to certain key officials at the embassy, at the Russian embassy. And so he, in 1935, began to sort of dip his toe into the waters of espionage, but never in an official way, or rather it was sort of semi-official. So he was given a control officer, and a code name, but he told his control officer he did not want to be considered a Soviet spy. His aim was to basically undermine Hitler and to give to Hitler's enemies information that could help defeat Hitler. A tremendously, traitorous act. Mildred in 1939 began also helping pass this information to the United States, and it's not much is known about this. And so my book is, I go into great detail about this. So in this way, I bring news about this aspect of their espionage. But to get back to your question, yes, they were involved in espionage for the Soviet Union then during the war. This is in part because after 1941, between 1939 and 1941, Mildred passed information, and Arvid did as well, to the United States. And then their key contact at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin left in June 1941. So they couldn't, they then intensified their efforts to pass information to the Soviet Union, and other members of the group also did begin to aid the Soviet Union, or pass top secret information, and participate in this form of espionage. Some of them became operators of the radio transmitters. Some of them acted as couriers, and information that Arvid Harnack had obtained at the Ministry of Economics, and information that one of their collaborators, Harro Schulze-Boysen, who was a senior lieutenant at the Luftwaffe, he obtained a wealth of information about Hitler's military strategies. And so all of this was passed to the Soviet Union. But, and where I'll just sort of like close the loop on this and end is a whole lot more to say about this, and I go into great detail in my book about this, and I accessed numerous archives in Russia and intelligence archives to bring this information forth. But basically Arvid Harnack and Harro Schulze-Boysen and some of their sources, including my grandfather, who was also in the resistance, obtained information, very specific information, that Hitler was about to invade the Soviet Union, and Stalin refused to believe this. And I've in my research, I found the report, and I feature a photograph of the of the front page of the report, on which is I'm slipping. Here we go. So on which is, if you see, there's some notation, a scrawl. That's Stalin's handwriting, and this is in a chapter called Stalin's Obscenity. He scrawls an obscenity, which I can't repeat here. So you'll have to read the book. But he essentially refused to believe that this was true, and told basically said, the people who gave me this information can do this and that and the other to their mother. So you can fill in the blanks. But he refused to believe that Hitler, who he had at that point, he had an alliance with, was about to invade him. And then a few days later, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. So anyway, espionage is and top secret intelligence and the conveying of that information to other countries, not only to the Soviet Union but also to Britain and the United States. This is a focal point of my book.
Okay, great. So one of the things that kind of struck me as very interesting in your book is, for lack of a better term, living the lie. You had individuals such as Mildred and then the other person that you mentioned that was very close to the German, state of government and the Nazis. And on one hand, they had to play it very close to their chest, but they also had to fake that they really were part of the Nazi party. Could you kind of go into that, just how close they were to being caught, but at the same time, they were trusted by a lot of these individuals they worked for?
Oh, sure. In Mildred's case, because she was an American, she couldn't get a job with the Ministry of Economics in the way, or in any other ministry in the way that her husband could as a German. She was an American, but she used that position to basically try to obtain information and then convey it to other countries in the hope that they could assist the underground resistance in Germany. She knew Martha Dodd at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, who was the daughter of the ambassador, and then she later developed a relationship with a diplomat there named Donald Heath and his wife Louise Heath, and then again participated in passing information to them. But she, as Arvid's, I'll also mention that she was the president of the American Women's Club in Berlin. So she was in one of the Soviet espionage files that I researched, I discovered a memo that said, Mildred Harnack is one of the most prominent women in American women in Berlin society, and she enjoyed that kind of. She was regarded as somebody who would lecture about American literature at the University of Berlin and also at the American Women's Club, and she taught in other schools as well, which I can speak to later. But and she was the wife of in 1935 when Arvid Harnack became. Started working at the Ministry of Economics. He was living a double life, and he masqueraded as a Nazi loyalist. And so then she also had to masquerade as a kind of the American wife of a Nazi loyalist. And so it was it was tremendously difficult for her, for both of them, to attempt to support a regime that they detested. But it was their conviction that at that point, having tried other methods of undermining the Nazi regime in 1933 and 34 and the early years of 1935, they concluded that their methods actually were not terribly effective. For those early years, really paper was their primary method. Their primary weapon against a fascist dictatorship. So they helped to produce leaflets denouncing Hitler's regime and calling for revolution. And if you got caught with one of these leaflets, this sounds very mild to our contemporary ears, but it was exceedingly dangerous. And it was an act of treason. And if you got caught with one of these leaflets, you would be sent to a concentration camp for at least a year. And that is indeed what happened to a number of her recruits. So in 1935, beginning then, to pose as a sort of a loyalist to the Nazi government as a way of trying to deceive them and then obtain information that basically to undermine the Nazi regime from within. That was an exceedingly dangerous endeavor. And also, I think, and I'll just speak very specifically about Mildred, because I have, again, as I mentioned earlier, all of her letters and to her mother in the United States. So she would write back to her mother and talk to her, share information about her experiences in Germany while she was in the resistance, while she was very much by 1935, she was leading meetings. We know this from archival documents, primary source documents. But I imagine that it was a tremendously lonely time for her too, as an American in Germany, surrounded. She again was alone in being this woman who was an American who was in this group, and then leading this double life. And one last point about this: in 1937, she went back to the United States to visit her family, and she visited her eldest sister, my great-grandmother, and others in the family, and they were just mystified and baffled. Here's Mildred. She left in 1929 to go to pursue a PhD in Berlin, and here she is now in 1937. They haven't seen her for years, and she seemed different to them, and they didn't understand exactly what had happened and why. I mean, they had gotten some information. They knew enough about what was going on in Germany to know that it was a fascist dictatorship and that Hitler was at the head of this. But they were so confused by how elusive she was and how she seemed quite paranoid that she was under surveillance. And she had every reason to believe that. The Gestapo was looking out for people just like her, and eventually did track her down. But she shared with her brother this idea. He said, "What's going on?" And she said, "I think I was followed." And he just thought she was crazy. And others in the family thought that she had gone Nazi, which I'm putting that in quotation marks because that's from a transcript and of an interview that was conducted with various members of my family in the 80s. And they were remembering, back then, the post-war years, their impressions of what was going on, what had gone on. And of course, that's the height of irony, because Mildred devoted herself and risked her life and eventually lost her life opposing the Nazi regime.
So speaking of, you've talked a little bit about the archives and some other things. Can you talk a little bit about the writing process? How did you sort of piece together all this information from different archives and repositories? Because sometimes you might not have the evidence specifically from your relative that's unfortunately no longer here, but how did you put all that together to tell a narrative like this?
Well, that's such a great question. And that was one of my first sort of artistic dilemmas. I had the letters. I knew that I would go and to research in as many archives as I could, this story. And I knew that a biography had been written about Mildred, 2 decades previous, but new information had come out since then. And of course, I was privy to information as a family member that nobody else had been privy to. And so I was tremendously grateful to have information. Shireen Breissack is the name of the biographer, and her book "Resisting Hitler" is a very important book and it's basically a kind of a cradle to grave biography, and she talks about her early life and all the way to her death. And when I decided that, and she interviewed people who were alive, several decades ago that of course are no longer with us. So that was important. But then I also realized that there were gaps in the story, and not only, Nazis destroyed a lot of evidence. They destroyed the evidence of the transcripts of the mass trial that Mildred was in, and others in her group. So we have the sentencing documents, but we don't have the actual transcripts. And you know, Mildred's letters, I have over 100 of them, but a lot of letters that she wrote to her family were lost because her own sister, my great-grandmother, urged family members to burn everything after Mildred was executed. Her execution was tremendously violent, and she was decapitated. She was beheaded by a guillotine, which struck the family as a tremendously medieval instrument of death, as it was. And other women in her group were also executed in this way. And it was the Nazis' special perversity to regard beheading as more humane than hanging, which is what the men in her group were subjected to. They were either hanged or shot. But their stories were erased essentially for many years. And getting back to my great-grandmother, she actually unwittingly participated, or one could maybe say wittingly, but she did say she participated in the erasure. Maybe this was her way of dealing with grief, but she said, burn everything. The sooner that we can erase this, the sooner we can move on with our lives. And there was also her concern. Now these are the post-war years, so we have the Cold War years, and so the taint of communism sort of attached itself to Mildred's legacy. And I can speak a lot more about this later. I have a lot to say about it, but essentially, her group was, the German intelligence, the Abwehr, had given them a name, the Red Orchestra, and this was not a name that they had given themselves. You know, Mildred referred to the group privately as the Circle, but the Red Orchestra was the name that the Nazis gave the group, and so because basically they gave the name an orchestra to any enemy espionage network. And when they discovered that members of her group had sent coded messages to Moscow, the Abwehr called the orchestra Red. And so Mildred Harnack and the others were sort of characterized as communists who were agents of Stalin, which was an inaccuracy, and many of them were not even aware that messages were being passed to Moscow Center as a way of trying to undermine Hitler. And also, I should say, just parenthetically, members of the group, they were social democrats. They were communists, certainly, but they were also, there was a spectrum. They tended to be on the left end of the spectrum. But there was no one sort of governing kind of principle in that respect. And they were also Jews, they were Catholics, they were atheists, and they were women and men, they were factory workers, they were professors and students. So it was a very diverse group. I feel like I've gone astray here. So the question I was answering had to do with what? Can you remind me? Or do you remember either?
I've been listening. Sorry, I've been absorbing all this.
It's a huge story. It's a very epic story, and so it's very easy
for me. The research process.
The research. Yes. Oh, right. The holes in the right. Thank you. It's bringing me back. So the holes in the story, and I began to so I knew that even members of my own family participated in creating some of these holes. The letters that I have, they exist because Mildred's own mother hid them in an attic, and nobody knew this until the 80s. So, so I have at least a good, share of the letters that she wrote, but certainly not all of them. So, holes that the Nazis created by destroying evidence, and then certainly Mildred burned her journal. There were all of these attempts to sort of erase, the evidence. She, of course, did not want to be She was very aware that if somebody would have gotten their hands on her journal, that she could be potentially arrested, and so she was also very careful, and she was also careful in her letters. She was aware that Nazi censors were reading her letters, so she often wrote in a kind of code. So I decided that I would do as much voluminous, robust research as possible, and visit multiple countries and do whatever I could to get my hands on documents and intelligence documents, including documents that were redacted and that were still classified. This many years later, in 2021, there are still, I submitted Freedom of Information Act requests, FOIA requests to declassify some of these documents, and some of them I succeeded in getting declassified. Some of them I did not. Some of them still, the Nazi War Crimes Act, basically following that in 1998, these documents started becoming declassified, but that's still a process that continues to this day. So then I was aware of yet another kind of hole, or in this case, you just look at a document and you just have a lot of black marks over the text, and you wonder what's behind it. I could surmise, but I don't know, in fact, exactly what's behind it. So I decided to embrace the holes in the narrative. And this is part of the reason why then I sort of developed a kind of narrative strategy where I thought, I want to show these documents in the book itself and not approach this in a conventional way where you do have a narrative, and then you have in the middle of a photo insert, so you can sort of flip to the photo insert in the middle, and then you continue. I did want an insert, but I also wanted throughout the book to have some of these documents sprinkled throughout and peppered throughout, and to sort of validate and authenticate and bring readers along with me in a way in this sort of scholarly detective story as I'm trying to seek answers. And also, when there were gaps, I did not, and there was no way of filling them. I thought, just like a piece of music, or in poetry, there is value in silence, and there is value in a kind of gap, and meaning, I should say, as well. So I definitely allow those gaps to sort of to exist and to resonate. And in fact, just for example, I brought this up earlier, the transcripts of the mass trial that don't exist because the Nazis destroyed them. There are a few different stories of what happened to them, and I address these in my endnotes. But instead of trying to invent, certainly I don't do this at all. I am very careful to use primary source documentation and to use quotation marks, and to be very fastidious in indicating where what and where I get my sources. But also, I make sure to indicate when, in fact, we don't know. And so that's quite clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we'll start taking some audience questions. We have a bunch that are starting already. So we have one asking about the title of your book. They ask, is it a direct translation from German?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that question. So the final days that Mildred had in solitary confinement prior to her execution, somebody smuggled in to her a book of Goethe poems. And so she spent her final days translating those poems into English. And in fact, in my book, I feature a scan, a photograph of two of these pages. The reason we have them and the reason we have the book is that at Plötzensee prison in Berlin, where she was executed, the prison chaplain, Harald Polschau, was secretly working for the resistance, and he met with her an hour before she was executed, and he smuggled it out. And his account, and he subsequently published a memoir. We're very fortunate to have this, because this is I know about what Mildred was doing the last hour of her life. And so, and when I was writing this book and trying to think about what title to give it, I thought, I know that Goethe poetry was she was admired Goethe, and I basically just thought, the title has to come from one of these poems. And in fact, it just seemed perfect. It seemed quite apt, all the frequent troubles of our days. And the hour also, for me, linked her time with our time, so that there's a kind of, arc that is, or sort of connective tissue that's established between that time and our time. And it's my hope that again, I mentioned this at the beginning of this talk, but that readers can see the relevance of her story, and the story of those who joined her in the resistance, and take away the very important lesson that we have to stand up to bullies.
Okay, we have a question, and you talked a little bit about this earlier, but we have somebody that's asking about hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, the Breissack biography. I think you did mention that earlier.
Yes, Shireen,
and then
Shireen
some other biographies. Yeah, could you maybe talk about that? What's your contribution when you wrote? Does it differ? Does it have anything that's the same?
Well, I think I did actually address this just about 5 minutes ago. The Breissack biography was published 2 decades ago by University Press, and we're very, very fortunate to have it. My grandmother provided her with Breissack with letters and photographs and so forth. So, and what was available at the time, what the family had at the time, and so as I mentioned, it's very important that we have that book, and that we have that, that it's, I acknowledge this in my book as well. I am so very grateful for the interviews that Shireen Breissack conducted with people who are no longer with us. And so we have that now. It's a part of the historical record. And my book is a different kind of book. I definitely decided, all right, it's been 2 decades. There's more information. More documents being declassified, as I mentioned. Even I was able to submit FOIA requests and get additional documents declassified. I also met with and interviewed extensively Mildred Harnock's 11-year-old courier, who, at the time I interviewed him, he was 89 years old. And so he gave me a tremendous amount of information. And at that time, he was most likely the only person that I knew of who was alive who had firsthand knowledge of Mildred Harnock's acts of espionage and actually had participated in them. And then after he passed away, his family gave me access to 12 steamer trunks of documents that helped me corroborate a lot of what he told me, including his mother's diaries and date books. So that actually blew the book for me wide open. And it's one of the reasons that the book is structured the way that it is, as 2 parallel narratives. I have Mildred's narrative, and then I have Don Heath Jr.'s narrative. And that's her 11-year-old courier, this American boy. And it was fascinating to me to get that perspective on what it was like to be an American in Nazi Germany as well.
So we have a question asking about the photographs in your book. Could you maybe talk about some of the key photographs that are in there that maybe have an interesting story, maybe our audience would like to hear about?
Photographs. Well, there are so many. The one that I shared with you, I'll just go back to the photo insert, were the Gestapo photographs. And again, this is really, it's quite striking to see the array of these photographs, and to see, and you can see how diverse the group was. and again, as I said, they were Jews and Catholics and atheists and men and women. Actually, 40% of the group were women. So this was very, this was quite significant. The Gestapo ended up arresting 119 men and women in this group in 1942, and so they all had their mugshots taken in this way, and other photographs in the book I feature. This is also one of my favorites. This one right here, which I own. I call this Mildred's badass photograph. Here she is dressed like a man. And in fact, my great grandmother was appalled when she saw her dressed this way. She said she looked like a tramp. And here she's standing next to Arvid, her husband. And they basically, this is around the time that they had just gotten married, and they hitchhiked to a small town in Colorado where they participated in a strike alongside coal miners. And so they were extremely politically active in the 20s, in the United States. And both of them also advocated for women's rights. And so you can see that continuum, straight from when they were both where they met at the University of Wisconsin, and then that carried through into Nazi Germany. But there are lots of photographs also. These are Don Heath. This is the 11-year-old Poirier, and here he is here as well. And this is Louise Heath, who was the person who actually introduced the Heaths and the Harnocks as she went to visit. She went to the American Women's Club to hear Mildred Harnock give a lecture, and then sort of put two and two together and realized, oh, that's the woman who's married to Arvid Harnock, who's at the Ministry of Economics, who my husband, speaking as Louise, wants to basically contact and convince to become a source. He had an ad hoc, I realized that we have not that much time, and I'm happy to talk about this some more, but Donald Heath had an arrangement with certain officials at the State Department to basically obtain information from key sources in Germany. This is before the United States had a centralized foreign intelligence agency, and so he was acting as a kind of intelligence agent. So I have photographs of them as well. And I have, as I mentioned before, photographs of things like the Stalin obscenity, and also, this is my favorite, and I'll just sort of end on this note, the notes that were passed in prison. This was one of my favorite, sort of most startling archival discoveries, and this was at the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand in Berlin, and the German Resistance Memorial Center, and I discovered these notes that were passed in prison between Mildred's co-conspirators. It was illegal for them and prohibited, against the rules for them to, as inmates to talk with one another. But so they found other ways of communicating. And so I basically discovered some of these notes, and they would hide them in the sort of the cracks and fissures of the prison walls, and they would also sew them into the hems of their garments, and so here I am. I keep on. Here we go. I got it. So there's one right there, and so you can see. I'll just sort of hold it up to the camera. There we go. You see that handwriting there. So this is on another document, but the notes, the handwriting is there, and on that particular note, one of Mildred's friends is writing about her, and it's actually writing about how one of the members of the group had actually betrayed Mildred to the Gestapo.
Okay, great. So speaking of photographs, this is a nice segue into this. We were talking earlier about the ebook or the electronic edition. As far as you know, are the pictures that you just talked about and showed us, those are going to be in the digital edition? Are they going to be in that, do you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Somebody was actually going to buy it.
I'm sorry?
Somebody was actually going to buy it, and they worried the pictures
yes,
weren't
buy the digital. Okay, so yes, please. They're definitely in there. I encourage you to buy the digital edition, actually, because as you remarked earlier, Derek, that Amazon is sold out and has been sold out since the third day that my book was published. So as of August 5th, it has been sold out. There will be more. My publisher is rushing a second printing, but right now they do, however, have available the e-version, and then your local bookstore. What's the name of it again, Derek?
The Learned Owl.
The Learned Owl. The Learned Owl has hard copies as well, so you have a choice.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions, and we have one that's specifically asking about Mildred, if she had the opportunity to meet any American modernist writers that she critiqued or translated that were living or writing in Europe in the 20s and 30s or even the 40s.
Well, I devote a lot of time or a lot of space in my book to Thomas Wolfe. It's quite well known that she interviewed him and published essays about him, and published an interview about him as well, and met with him, and in fact tried to recruit him, or rather tried to recruit a German author, and tried to use Thomas Wolfe as sort of a way to get to that author. And so she accompanied him with others, including Martha Dodd, to visit Rudolf Ditzen, aka Hans Fallada, to try to recruit him into the resistance. She was unsuccessful. But the Thomas Wolfe connection to Mildred Harnack was fascinating to me, because if anybody knows anything about Thomas Wolfe's allegiance to Germany, at first he was just enamored with Germany, and he just thought it was the greatest thing ever, and it was a nonstop party for him, really, when he came to Germany, when he came to Berlin. Germans loved him. His book was extremely popular, and his novel, and then he had this torrid affair with Martha Dodd. Mildred really was disturbed that he didn't quite understand the dark underbelly of Germany, and she tried to talk to him about this, and then later it's clear that Thomas Wolfe came to understand in a more nuanced and way what exactly was going on in Germany. He actually wrote about it as well, and that he had undergone a kind of change, and this happened right before he died, but some of his last writing was about that sort of trajectory for him as being an American writer who was enamored with Germany, and then came to realize that it was not all that he thought it was.
Okay. Great. Our last question asks, have you had any contact with the current generation of great German academic families whose members not only won Nobel Prizes in the past, but gave their lives to resisting Hitler? He also mentions this may have been in the book, but he hasn't finished it yet. So he just wants to know if you mentioned it.
I'm sorry, the question was what?
Oh, have you had contact with the current generation of great German academic families whose members have not only won Nobel Prizes, but gave their lives resisting to Hitler? And if you mention it in your book.
Well, to the questioner, I would urge you to read my book, so that you can see what I do write about in terms of Mildred's connection to the great German academic families. Through her husband, Arvid Harnack, she was related to the Bonhoeffers, the Delbrucks, the Dochnanyis, and these families all intermarried, and the Bonhoeffers were the most well-known. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Klaus Bonhoeffer, also Ernst von Harnack and Justus Delbruck. They were all involved in the Valkyrie 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, and they were all executed. Justus Delbruck died in prison prior to being executed, but yeah, they were all executed, and they were considered part of the sort of the grand German tradition, these grand academic families. And in fact, and because of that, they had access that others, the working class Germans, did not. So the Germans who Mildred recruited from, and I didn't really get a chance to talk about this, but she did, after she worked at the University of Berlin and lectured there, she subsequently got a position at a night school for adults and in Germany and in Berlin. And her students were primarily unemployed Germans and impoverished Germans. And some of them became her most loyal recruits. And they didn't have the access that Arvid Harnack did. I mean, it's no accident that Arvid Harnack and Harl Schulze-Boysen were definitely considered, members of the elite, and were therefore able to gain these positions, these high-level positions within the Nazi regime, and which then gave them access to intelligence that then they were able to, as I spoke of before, steal and give to Hitler's enemies. But that access was provided to them because of their lineage. In Arvid's case, and in Harl Schulze-Boysen's case, he was married to Libertas Schulze-Boysen, who had a very well-connected family. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming out, Rebecca, to talk about your
It's my
book. It was
pleasure.
wonderful hearing from you, and everybody enjoyed it. So thank you so much for everybody at Hudson Library, and have a nice evening, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's been absolutely a pleasure.
Great. Good night.